Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 40, The Elderly Emperor. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Emperor Louis made some personnel changes in the court when he took away the lands of Counts Hugh of Tours and Matfred of Orleans, and made Count Bernard of Septimania his chamberlain. Since Hugh and Matfred were supporters of Lothar, and Bernard had allied with Louis's new wife Judith, the emperor had clearly decided to weaken his eldest son. Unsurprisingly, there was a revolt, and the emperor was imprisoned. Lothar appeared triumphant, but he wanted to rule as emperor rather than share the empire with his brothers Pippin and Louis. So Emperor Louis offered Pippin and Louis more lands. They accepted the offer, and Lothar was exiled to Italy. Great, the family drama had been resolved, until the emperor changed his mind and forgave Lothar. Unsurprisingly, Pippin and Louis revolted. Hoping to resolve the situation, the emperor held an assembly with his sons, but this time Lothar, Pippin, and Louis remained united, so Emperor Louis found himself in a monastery. Once again, Lothar wanted to replace his father as emperor, and once again, Pippin and Louis did not want to bend the knee to Lothar. The end of brotherly unity did not take long to appear. The new emperor held an assembly in October 833, but Louis proclaimed his independence by refusing to attend. At this point, Lothar had two choices: acknowledge his brother's autonomy and wait until his father died, while gathering enough support to overwhelm his insubordinate brothers, or force an immediate confrontation. He was a Carolingian, so he forced a confrontation. First, he humiliated his father by arranging a ceremony where Emperor Louis publicly acknowledged that he had been a bad ruler and exchanged his imperial robes for the clothes of a monk. Instead of strengthening Lothar's position, this public display gave King Louis an opportunity. Emperor Louis had always had more support in the eastern half of the empire, and Louis gathered nobles from those regions in Frankfurt from October 833 to February 834, where he basically bought support in exchange for generous grants of land. It is not clear where all of these lands came from, but some definitely came from nobles who were openly backing Lothar. Louis gained the backing of several influential abbots and bishops, most notably two of his uncles, Bishop Drogo of Metz and Abbot Hugh of St. Quentin. Remember, these were the illegitimate sons of Charles the Great, who had been exiled to remote monasteries at the beginning of Louis's reign to remove their claims to the throne. Admittedly, they had been released and given influential positions in the clergy. Still, it may seem strange that they supported their half-brother Emperor Louis, but they likely felt that their situation would get worse if Lothar was emperor. If you were wondering why so many of these powerful men were abbots or bishops, it is a side effect of the Carolingian habit of placing inconvenient brothers and sons in important positions in the church rather than executing them. They would still have influence, which likely made them more willing to accept the offer rather than revolt, but they abandoned any claim to the throne. As wealthy landowners, they could raise their own small armies, so their support had great practical value, as well as not inconsiderable moral value. At the same time, Louis's expanded territory required a much larger administration, enabling him to give more offices to supporters. Aside from personnel changes, Louis made a minor change to his own official rank. Previously, he was described as King of Bavaria by divine grace. Now he was simply King by divine grace. Basically, his kingdom no longer had boundaries, a clear indication that he intended to expand. He generally described himself as King of East Frankia. While it seemed obvious that Louis was preparing for open conflict with his older brother, Lothar was still taken by surprise in early 834 when Louis appeared with an army. At the same time, Pippin moved north with his own army. It is unlikely that Lothar was surprised by the offensive itself, but rather the speed of the advance. Louis left Frankfurt on February 5th and was approaching Paris by February 28th. covering 400 miles in 3 weeks. Either Louis had become an impressive general, or he was served by an impressive general. Regardless, Lothar did the math and fled to Burgundy, leaving the former Emperor Louis and Charles behind. Unsurprisingly, the bishops in the area promptly held a ceremony on March 1st, and the monk Louis was Emperor Louis once again. The emperor was grateful to his loyal sons, but once again, Pippin received little more than thanks and a confirmation of the territories that he already had. Again, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that Louis had not forgiven his son Pippin for placing him in a comfortable cell. Louis, king of East Frankia, had orchestrated the offensive and, most important, raised the larger army, so the emperor asked him to stay at Aachen for a while. While Louis Sr. had been restored to the throne with surprisingly little bloodshed, supporters on both sides had decided to settle some scores. Lothar's key supporters were Hugh and Matfred, whose lands had largely been given to Counts Odo and William, cousins of Bernard of Septimania, so the emperor sent the counts with an imperial army against Hugh and Matfred. Either the imperial troops were unwilling to fight, or they fought badly. The details are unclear, but the result is clear. They lost, and Odo and William were killed as they retreated. Possibly they were simply executed when they were captured. In the end, the tide seemed to be turning in Lothar's favor. Building on the momentum, Lothar turned around and marched north. When the city of Chalon-sur-Saône, between Dijon and Lyon, resisted, he torched it. Otherwise, he spared the garrison, but he executed 3 prisoners. 2 of those 3 prisoners were Counts Goslem and Sanillo. Goslem was a brother of Bernard of Septimania, and Sanillo had played a key role in the rise of Bernard since he had made the initial accusations against Count Bera of Barcelona in 820 that had ensured that the position of Count of Barcelona became vacant. Finally, Bernard's sister Gerberga was taken out of her convent, accused of witchcraft, and executed. Clearly, Lothar was taking revenge. However, Lothar's decision to delay at Chalon-sur-Saône proved fatal because his father and brothers arrived with an army in August before he could link up with Hugh and Matfred. Once again, the members of the royal family avoided a battle between them, so Lothar bent the knee, was forgiven, and banished south of the Alps. Despite a promise to never, ever rebel again, ever, Lothar probably started plotting again as soon as he was safely across the Alps. Why didn't the neighbors take advantage of the family squabbles to invade? Well, Theophilus, emperor of the Eastern Empire, had his own problems. Wait, who was Theophilus? Theophilus was the son of Emperor Michael. The empire was stable, if not thriving, when he died in bed on October 829. Since Theophilus was 16 when Michael died, he succeeded his father as sole emperor, so there was no need for a regency council. A competent military leader, Theophilus took governing seriously. The empire was wealthy, or rather, Theophilus spent money freely but did not go into debt. Much of that money was spent rebuilding the capital. He enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, but he also rebuilt the sea walls in the capital. Anyway, Theophilus was at war with the Caliphate by 830. The war went well at first, but the empire was losing soon after, so Constantinople was unable to take advantage of the repeated civil wars between a constantly changing set of family members, although nobles likely made snide remarks about the emperor in the west who could not seem to discipline his sons. While the Eastern Empire was preoccupied, there was a growing threat in the north. The revolts during the past couple of years were the result of scheming between court factions, intensified by too many adult sons. But the main problem was that Emperor Louis had proven unable to either satisfy the nobles with new lands or make them fear the consequences if they revolted. Charles the Great had maintained order with a bloody ruthlessness, so Louis began to appear weak. This weakness was dangerous since the empire had grown richer. Most important, coins had gradually replaced bartering in the main trade centers like Dorestad and Quentovic, so there were large piles of treasure just waiting to be taken. The Vikings took notice of this and began to plan raids. Charles the Great had responded to Viking raids by fortifying the river mouths in the north and the west, since these were the main highways into the empire. These defenses were sufficient, so he had few problems during his reign. That situation changed when he was succeeded by his son, and the repeated squabbles between Emperor Louis and his sons left the coastal defenses weakened, since their respective armies were marching around the interior of the empire rather than guarding the borders. To be fair, few Scandinavian leaders were able to gather large fleets during Charles's rule, but the situation had clearly changed several decades later. A large fleet attacked Dorestad in 834, which should have been a wake-up call for the ruling family. Horik, the surviving son of Godfred, was able to maintain stable control over Denmark, or at least a significant part of Denmark. Viking raids on Frisia continued throughout his reign, but there was little evidence that he organized the raids. He certainly did not lead them. In theory, the region should have been protected by Harald Klak, who had been given lands in the region, but he was old by then and seems to have been unable to drive off the raiders. Since Lothar was repeatedly exiled to Italy, it is worth asking what was happening in Italy. Duke Grimoald of Benevento had been succeeded by his son Grimoald IV as Duke in 806. Apparently, Grimoald was an ineffective ruler since he was assassinated by his relative Sico in 817. Sico faced little resistance to the coup and was succeeded smoothly by his son Sicard, who focused on finally conquering Naples. Victory seemed guaranteed by 835. The Eastern Empire was focused on survival, and the Frankish Empire was occupied with a series of revolts by the sons of Emperor Louis. However, the leaders of Naples hired Arab mercenaries based out of Sicily. There is no record of major battles, but the results are clear. Benevento and Naples signed a treaty on July 4th, 836. Neither would shelter the other's enemies, and Benevento would not use Capua to block merchants from traveling from Naples to Rome. Moreover, the territorial boundaries were clearly defined. While the treaty had resolved numerous issues, the 5-year expiration date on the treaty may have been a little worrisome. More likely, it was a realization that neither side would be willing to follow the treaty for more than 5 years. The belief would be proven correct in late 838 when the Lombards began to look at Amalfi with lust in their eyes. Officially, it came under the authority of Naples, but Benevento-controlled Salerno was much closer. So Sicard attacked Amalfi but did not encounter much resistance. Great. Benevento appeared to be on the verge of building a major kingdom in southern Italy, until Sicard was assassinated by Rodelcus in 839. Salerno backed Sico's brother Sidikov, which led to a civil war between Salerno and Benevento. Despite the support of some residents of Amalfi, the majority simply wanted to be independent, which meant independent from Naples as well. So southern Italy broke up into Benevento, Salerno, Amalfi, and Naples. Unfortunately, this separation was not a mature realization by calm leaders, but a refusal of the smaller entities to submit to Benevento, which led to increased violence and instability. Once again, it is worth pointing out that the individual cities would have been juicy targets for the Frankish Empire if the empire had been able to focus its resources on a campaign into southern Italy. Speaking of the Frankish Empire, had the conflict between the emperor and his sons finally calmed down? In theory, there was an opportunity for a return to stability. Sad to say, but the opportunity was caused by an epidemic that had hit the region. In particular, Lothar's senior followers, Hugh, Matfred, and Walla, all died roughly a year after Lothar had submitted. These men were from an older generation, and they all had personal grudges with the emperor. To be fair, these grudges had merit. Walla had been confined to a monastery for years, while Hugh and Matfred had lost most of their lands when Emperor Louis decided to reward his new in-laws. But their deaths created vacancies for younger nobles in Lothar's court, nobles with different priorities. To put the situation into perspective, Counts Hugh, Matfred, and Walla had died in 837, when Emperor Louis was 59 years old. The odds were that he would die in a few years. If the emperor could maintain good relations with his other sons, he might enjoy peace during his remaining years. By this time, it was clear that the emperor would never forgive Pippin. Fair enough. What about Louis? While King Louis was determined to expand his territory, he did not neglect Bavaria. Having received authority to issue his own charters, Louis used that authority to build a network of supporters among the clergy. He also steadily placed his own men in key positions on the eastern frontier of Bavaria to ensure that he did not have to worry about that region. King Louis seemed dominant, which would be expected, since his father was sitting on a throne instead of a bench in a cold monastery because of him. While it would be natural for the emperor to be grateful to Louis, the emperor seemed to view his son as a rival. In fact, the emperor immediately began working to regain control of eastern Frankia, handing out grants to important abbots, bishops, and nobles in the region. He pointedly stayed out of Bavaria, as if he wanted everyone to understand that Louis was king of Bavaria, and only Bavaria. While it was undoubtedly frustrating to watch his father interfere in what he viewed as his territories, Louis seems to have gritted his teeth and consoled himself with the thought that the emperor was not getting any younger. So he became a dutiful son, attended every assembly, and named his second son Louis. Having demonstrated loyalty to his father, King Louis reasonably presumed that he now occupied the position of favorite son. Then he attended the emperor's assembly at Aachen in late 837, where the emperor announced that 14-year-old Charles would be king of Neustria, Frisia, and part of Burgundy. At first glance, this was yet another proposed plan for the inheritance, likely to be altered within a few months. Except that this time, Charles became king immediately, and the lords of the territories swore allegiance to him. Still, King Louis was the only other son present. He did not lose any land to his half-brother, and he officially approved of the decision, so his position seemed strong, unlike Lothar, who was stuck in Italy. Everything looked good for King Louis until he officially asked his father for the same independent authority that had been granted to his much younger half-brother. At the same time, he apologized that he would miss the next assembly since he was meeting with Lothar to resolve the issue of the blocked Bremer Pass in the Alps. While these actions seemed natural, Emperor Louis had been imprisoned twice by his sons and was a little suspicious. Honestly, it would be amazing if he was not completely paranoid. So he responded by mobilizing his army and ordered King Louis to appear at Aachen to explain himself. Louis apparently managed to satisfy his father, so he was not punished, but he also failed to receive independent authority. This situation was far more serious than a rivalry between sons for their father's affection. Frankish expansion had been so effective because they had remained united. Given the frequency of coups and the imprisonment of fathers, brothers, and sons, this unity seems a little hard to believe. However, all of these conflicts have been bloodless, or at least the number of deaths were inconsequential given the violence of the era. Franks had not fought each other in a major military battle in over a century. Given this impressive record of non-violent resolution of conflicting claims, Emperor Louis seems to have believed that King Louis would accept losing his position as favorite son. To sum up, Louis and Pippin attacked Lothar, forcing him to release their father from the monastery, and he became emperor again. The fighting did not end immediately, and several relatives of Bernard of Septimania were killed. Still, Lothar could not face his father and his two brothers, so he retreated across the Alps to the safety of Italy. Since the empire was too busy with the family squabbles to defend the empire's borders, Vikings raided the trade center of Dorestad. Even so, none of the empire's neighbors were strong enough to invade the empire. Since the emperor had not forgiven Pippin for imprisoning him during the first revolt, Louis appeared to have become the dominant son. However, the emperor did not react well when Louis asked his father for greater independence. Worse, the emperor gave 14-year-old Charles full authority over his lands, signaling that Charles had become the emperor's favorite. So, how would Louis react to his position as second favorite son? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.